In the hallway, sitting against the wall, was their mother. Her name was Tiffanie Lucas. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She just stared at the floor, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. She didn't say a word, not when the officers spoke to her, not when they read her rights, not even when she was taken into custody. News of the crime spread quickly. By noon, the street was blocked off with yellow police tape. Reporters showed up with cameras. Neighbors stood at the edge of their driveways, whispering in disbelief. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Why? How could a mother do this to her own children? What had gone so wrong inside that quiet little house? People who knew the family were stunned. Tiffanie had always seemed like a devoted mother. She posted photos of her sons online, smiling on Halloween, holding homemade signs on the first day of school, cuddling with the family dog. Friends said she kept to herself, but never showed any signs of violence or cruelty. Her boys were polite, energetic, and full of life. No one saw this coming. But as the hours passed, the story began to unravel. Investigators started to piece together a timeline, searching for answers in the wreckage of what had once been a family. The town of Springfield, forever changed, could only wait and wonder what darkness had taken root behind that closed front door. Tiffanie Lucas had built a life that, at first glance, looked ordinary. She was a single mother, raising 2 young sons on her own. She had lived in the same modest home on Oak Ridge Lane for several years, and while she kept a low profile, there was nothing outwardly alarming about her. People who interacted with her described her as soft-spoken, polite, and often tired. She didn't have close friends in the area, but she was known enough to exchange small talk at the local gas station or grocery store. Her children, Jayden and Eli, were seen often riding their bikes in the driveway or playing in the front yard. To many, she looked like a woman simply trying to get by. But behind the curtain of normalcy, cracks had begun to form. A few neighbors started remembering strange moments. One woman recalled seeing Tiffanie pacing outside at night, barefoot in the cold, mumbling to herself. Another mentioned a time she'd seen her sitting motionless in the car for nearly an hour, staring straight. Her head not blinking, not moving. Still, no one intervened. In a small town, people often assumed it was better to mind their own business. But in this case, that silence became deadly. As investigators dug into Tiffany's past, more troubling signs emerged. There had been previous encounters with social services. A few months earlier, someone had filed a report expressing concern for the children's well-being. The report detailed erratic behavior, yelling that didn't make sense, claims that her sons were being watched by someone invisible, and talk of evil spirits. But when child welfare agents arrived, the home was neat, the children looked healthy, and Tiffanie answered their questions calmly. The case was marked as unsubstantiated and quietly closed. She had no history of violent crime, no documented mental illness. But what she did have was a growing pattern of isolation and paranoia. Her internet search history revealed a descent into confusion and fear. She had been researching topics about the occult, demons, and spiritual warfare. She'd clicked on forums that discussed whether children could be possessed or controlled by darkness. She had even visited websites about mothers who had killed their children, reading the headlines, scrolling through the details, as if trying to understand or justify something brewing inside her. Financial records painted an equally bleak picture. She had lost her part-time job at a daycare just weeks before the murders. Her bank account showed frequent overdraft fees. Her utilities had been shut off once in the last year. There was no sign of child support, no steady income, and no family nearby to help. Tiffanie was under pressure emotionally, mentally, and financially. And yet, no one realized how close she was to breaking. What made it even more chilling was the effort she had put into hiding the spiral. She continued posting on social media, often sharing uplifting quotes or pictures of her sons smiling at school events. From the outside, she appeared stable, but inside something had gone terribly wrong, and no one knew just how far she would fall until it was too late. In the days following the murders, investigators turned their attention to what happened in the final hours before the tragedy. They spoke to teachers, neighbors, and store clerks, anyone who might have seen or spoken to Tiffanie or her sons on that last day. From what they pieced together, November 7th began just like any other. That morning, Jayden and Eli arrived at school on time. Their teachers said they were cheerful, engaged, and showed no signs that anything was wrong at home. Jayden had read aloud in class, something he was proud of. Eli had drawn a picture of their dog, taping it proudly to the wall. When the final bell rang, both boys boarded the school bus and were dropped off outside their home just before 4 p.m. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed Tiffanie later that evening. She was seen filling up her car and walking inside to pay. Her face looked tired, but not unusually so. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't seem upset. It was just another mundane moment, one of the last caught on camera before everything changed. Back at the house, the evening passed quietly. The boys had dinner, chicken nuggets and macaroni found untouched in the trash. Their pajamas were later found neatly folded on their beds, as if she had gone through the motions of bedtime. There were no signs of a struggle. No raised voices were heard by neighbors. Everything pointed to a calm, ordinary night. But at some point after midnight, something shifted. The forensic team determined the time of death to be between 1 and 2 a.m. The evidence was chillingly clear. Tiffanie had retrieved a .40 caliber handgun from a locked box in her bedroom. It was legally registered to her. She loaded it, walked into the room where her sons were sleeping, and shot each of them once in the head at close range. There were no defensive wounds, no attempts to run. The boys likely never even woke up. The shots were muffled by the closed bedroom door and the insulation of the house. None of the neighbors heard anything unusual. There were no screams, no cries for help, just silence. What followed was even more unsettling. Tiffanie did not immediately call the police. She did not attempt to flee. Instead, she remained in the house with the bodies of her sons for nearly an hour. During that time, she did not make a single phone call. No texts were sent. Investigators believe she may have been in a dissociative state, detached from reality. Finally, sometime around 3 a.m., she left the house. Still barefoot, still in the same blood-stained clothes, she wandered down the road until a passing driver spotted her and made the call that would bring everything to light. When deputies arrived, they described her as distant, unresponsive, and emotionally flat. She gave no explanation. She did not resist arrest. As officers entered the house and discovered the bodies, the weight of what had happened settled over the small town like a thick fog, suffocating, heavy, and impossible to escape. As investigators continued their work, they uncovered more disturbing layers to the case, details that painted a fuller and far darker picture of Tiffanie Lucas's mental state and the events leading up to the night she killed her children. Every piece of evidence, every interview, and every file they reviewed pointed toward a mind slowly unraveling and a system that failed to recognize the warning signs in time. They began with her digital footprint. Tiffany's laptop and phone were taken in as evidence and revealed a timeline of troubling searches. Weeks before the murders, she had spent hours on conspiracy theory forums, researching topics like government mind control and spiritual warfare. She had bookmarked pages about demonic possession in children and read articles about mothers who had harmed their families under the belief they were saving them. Her YouTube history included hours of videos claiming children could be vessels for evil spirits and that cleansing rituals were needed to protect them. In her journal, found tucked under her mattress, investigators read page after page of rambling thoughts. Most entries were barely coherent. She wrote about being watched through the walls, about voices whispering to her at night. She believed her sons were being manipulated by a dark force, and that she alone had been chosen to stop it. The entries became more frantic as the days went on. She began referring to herself not as mom, but as a guardian of purity. In one passage, dated just 3 days before the murders, she wrote that her children were already gone, and that only their shells remain. The most heartbreaking twist came from the involvement, or lack thereof, of Child Protective Services. 3 weeks before the murders, a neighbor had made a formal complaint, saying they feared for the safety of the children. The complaint described Tiffany as erratic and paranoid. A caseworker had visited the home, and while they noted that Tiffany seemed anxious, they also found a clean living space, 2 seemingly healthy boys, and no immediate threats. The case was closed within 5 days. No follow-up visit was scheduled. It wasn't the only red flag. The school had also sent home a report noting that one of the boys had arrived in class wearing the same clothes for 3 days in a row. When asked about it, Tiffany reportedly told the school office they were struggling financially and couldn't afford laundry detergent. Again, there was no deeper investigation. The signs were everywhere, but each one was small enough to be dismissed on its own. Even Tiffany's family, those who lived out of state, shared that they had grown concerned. One cousin said she'd received a message from Tiffany weeks before the murders that simply read, "If something happens to me, know I tried." But when the cousin tried to follow up, the messages went unanswered. No one had a full picture of how bad things had gotten. By the time law enforcement connected all the dots, it was too late. The system that was supposed to protect the most vulnerable had missed its chance, and the lives of 2 innocent boys were lost because no one saw the complete story until it ended in unimaginable violence. After the horror on Oak Ridge Lane became public, the case of Tiffanie Lucas sent shockwaves beyond the quiet borders of Springfield, Kentucky. News outlets from across the country picked up the story, each headline more jarring than the last. A mother had killed her 2 sons in the middle of the night, and no one could explain why. The details were grim, the outcome irreversible, and the questions endless. Tiffany was arrested at the scene and formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. She was held without bail, transported under heavy guard to the Washington County Detention Center. Yet even in custody, she remained largely silent. She didn't speak to officers. She refused interviews. She would sit still in her cell for hours at a time, staring at the wall, not responding when spoken to. Psychologists were brought in to evaluate her. After several assessments, she was found unfit to stand trial. The court ruled that her mental condition made her incapable of understanding the charges against her or participating in her own defense. Rather than going to prison, she was committed to a state psychiatric hospital for long-term treatment. No timeline was given for potential recovery, and no trial date was ever set. For many in the community, it felt like there would never be justice, just a quiet vanishing into the legal and mental health system. The courts had spoken, but the grief and confusion remained. The community of Springfield struggled to come to terms with what had happened. A memorial of teddy bears, candles, and handwritten notes grew outside the Lucas home, left by neighbors and strangers alike. Some mourned the boys. Others wrestled with their own guilt, wondering if they had missed a chance to intervene. Teachers at the boys' school held a candlelight vigil. Their classmates, too young to understand the full scope of the tragedy, asked questions their parents couldn't answer. The case also sparked a broader conversation about mental health, especially among single mothers living in poverty. Advocacy groups called for reform in child protective services, pointing to this case as a clear example of a system stretched too thin to catch early signs of crisis. There were petitions for more funding, more caseworkers, and better mental health screening for parents flagged by schools or neighbors. But for many, the changes came too late. In the months that followed, no new information emerged. Tiffanie remained in the psychiatric facility. No interviews, no statements, no insight into the night she ended her son's lives. The silence was haunting. The house on Oak Ridge Lane sat empty for months before it was quietly sold. The family name was removed from the mailbox. Inside, the furniture had been cleared, but the shadows of what had happened there remained. The story of Jayden and Eli became a tragic reminder of what can happen when signs go unnoticed and suffering is left in the dark. To this day, the question remains unanswered. What truly happened in the mind of Tiffanie Lucas? No one knows, and perhaps no one ever will.